Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending my presentation today. I'm really glad so many people are interested in sign languages. I just wanted to ask you, who here has learned a sign language before? Which ones? ASL? ASL? Oh, French sign language, that's good. Oh, that's good. So French sign language as well?
A bit of LSQ.
Oh, that's good. Quebec sign language? Oh, that's good. Anyone else? Oh, that's quite good. Who here has doesn't know anything about sign languages? Okay, that's good. That's what this presentation is for. So that's good. So today I'll start with the introduction, and then I'll present 10 myths and misconceptions about sign languages. And then I thought of 15 reasons to learn a sign language. These reasons are not completely serious. It's a bit funny, but still good reasons in my opinion. And then I'll end with a few minutes for questions. So, to introduce the topic for today, there's a lot of people. So, this presentation is not a sign language workshop. So, sorry to disappoint those who thought it was a workshop. Just wanted to add something about terminology for sign languages. These are different ways to talk about sign languages. So you can say sign language. You can say signed language if you want to insist on the visual modality. You can refer to any sign language by its name. And in some languages, not in English, but there's a difference between language as a cognitive thing and a specific form of communication used by a community, like French use langage and langue. So it's very important to say in French langue des signes and not langage des signes because it's a real linguistic language. So who uses sign languages? Sign languages are the natural languages of deaf communities. So you might have noticed there's a capital Z. I underlined it just to be sure everyone notices. So deaf with a capital D is the cultural way to refer to deaf people. So these are people who use sign language, who identify with being deaf, and for who deafness is not a disability but just an identity. Deaf with a lowercase d is the medical point of view, so it's someone who can't hear. Someone who can hear to some extent is usually called hard of hearing, and such people usually speak. Some people use the word hearing impaired, but some other people view it kind of negatively, so it's better not to use it, but it's still a very common word. And words not to use are deaf mute and deaf and dumb. Those, do not ever say them. They're very outdated. Oh, and I just wanted to add something. So I told you about deaf and hard of hearing people, and I have something to tell you. You are hearing. You might not have thought of it before in your life, but you are hearing. That's the word that is used to refer to people who are not deaf. Okay, so on to myths and misconceptions. One common misconception is that sign languages are not languages, but they are gestures or something. But, what's going on? Okay, so sign languages are real languages. So, what is a language? If you have any background in linguistics, you probably have thought about it before, have learned about it. I'm not going to dive into any kind of detail into it, but William Stokoe did some work on American Sign Language back in the 60s, and that was really the foundation for sign language linguistics today. Sign languages obey most of Hockett's design features, not the sound feature, but all the other ones. And this is a continuum between gesticulation, so just gestures while someone's speaking, all the way to sign language. So things to the left are less linguistics, and things to the right are more linguistic. So if you're not familiar with the word emblems, it's basically conventionalized gestures like the thumbs up sign that are used by the community, and it's a very limited set of gestures. So sign languages are in the visual gestural modality, so that causes three main features: simultaneity. How did you say that? Simultaneity, use of space, and iconicity. So this word. So this is the use of different things at the same time. It's reflected in different ways in sign languages. So in phonology, which is for spoken languages, the study of sounds and how they work in words and things like that. In sign languages, there are no sounds. I hope I'm not teaching you something new here. But there is phonology, and it happens all at the same time. I'm going to expand on it a bit later. It's the same thing in morphology. You can have a lot of morphemes in one sign. So for example, I've heard of a sign in Japanese sign language, which is this. And this means, have you told her? So in English or most spoken languages, you have a lot of words to express the same thing that is expressed in one sign. Classifiers is an interesting part of sign languages. It is hand shapes that have some meaning. So for example, in American Sign Language, ASL, this is a person, or it can be this sometimes as well. This is a vehicle, like a car or a truck or bicycle or anything. So these are hand shapes that are used to refer to specific semantic categories, and they can be used to make new signs as well. So the word for the sign for jump is this, so it's a person who jumps. So it's used productively in that way. Another consequence of simultaneity is non-manuals. So it's everything that is not produced on the hands. I'm going to expand on that a bit later as well. And something that is very unique to sign languages and not found in spoken languages is the use of two hands, two articulators, that you only have one mouth and you can't like speak with only one side of your mouth. That doesn't work very well. But in sign language, you have two hands. Sometimes you use two hands to produce a sign, but sometimes you use one hand. People usually have a dominant hand. For me, it's my right hand. For some people, it's their left hand. It doesn't really matter. You just have to avoid switching in the middle of a sentence, because that confuses people. So in sign languages, space is used in two main ways. There's a topographic space, which is the spatial, it's a use of space as it is in reality. So you picture a scene in your mind, and you act like things are in front of you in the way they are in reality. So for example, you might have a house, and you set it here, and then you have someone who's here, and that is supposed to look like something you have in your mind. Another use of space is for syntax. So you set up people in the space in front of you, and that kind of acts like pronouns. So for example, you have a girl, can put it in the space to your left, and a boy, and you put him on the space to your left, and then you can use verbs to indicate who does what to whom. So you can say the girl gives to the boy, the boy gives to the girl, I give to the boy, I give to the girl gives to me, and so on. So it can be used in that way as well. Another myth: sign languages are just pictures on the hands. But that is wrong. Signs are more than just pictures on the hands. So the third consequence of the visual modality I told you about before is iconicity. So basically it's the relation between a sign and its meaning. And it is something that is easier to use in the visual modality as opposed to the auditory modality. There are some languages that have more words that come from sounds. I've heard Japanese is a bit like that. But in sign languages, it's more prevalent. It helps somewhat with the acquisition of signs, but most people, when they see a sign, might have some idea of what it means, but not always. And usually it's after you've been told the meaning of the sign that you're like, oh, yeah, I knew that. Iconicity can change with time. Some etymology can be lost, and then the sign doesn't have any leftover relation to its meaning. And different languages make different choices. For example, a bicycle has handlebars, has wheels, has pedals, and different languages use different features to show the sign. I'm going to tell you a bit about sign language phonology. So signs are made of 4 main parts: the hand shape, movement, location, and palm orientation. So let me give you an example. The sign for I have no idea. Let's say the sign for a chair. Okay. So it's like this. You have 2 hand shapes for both hands. Movement is some contact, double contact. Location, one hand is on top of the other, and the orientation is that the palms are oriented to the bottom.
So is it important if you do it here or here or?
Most signs are produced in the neutral space in front of you. It's easier for you to produce usually, but sometimes there are minimal pairs, and you have different meanings according to where you put the sign. Another question? Can you just wait for the microphone?
I'm gonna need to use my hands for this, though. Do you see where I'm getting at here? Okay, so So to answer your question, you're asking about location, like where to put your sign. Yeah, she mentions you place it in sort of the neutral zone in front of you when you're telling a story. But depending on how many characters you have in your story, you may want to relocate.
Yes.
Maybe that person is sitting on this chair. Maybe that other person is sitting on this chair. And the number of times that you make that gesture or that sign can sometimes indicate a noun or a verb. So for example, this is a chair, so I'm tapping my two fingers together multiple times. That's a chair. But if I do it one time, it's like an action. Sit.
Yes.
That person is sitting down. That person here, sitting down. So yeah, that wanted to sort of clarify that.
Yeah, that's a very good answer. And verbs can also be inflected for aspect, but yeah, that's a very good answer. So, one of the most common myths I hear is sign language is universal. And sorry to tell you, but it is not. There are many different sign languages in the world. There's no exact number, but just to be sure we don't overestimate them, there are over 135 sign languages, probably a couple hundred. They're organized in sign language families. Sometimes they have more overlap than spoken language families do, but you can see families. For example, French Sign Language, LSF, is a language that has a lot of different languages that were derived from it. Sign languages, like all languages, are a product of culture, so it makes sense that different cultures have different languages. Do you think it would be possible for people all around the world to spontaneously have the same language? It could be possible, but the odds are quite slim. So people just develop different languages. There are some dialects in sign languages because of the different factors. For example, geography. In the sign language used in the Netherlands, for example, there are dialects used in the north, the west, and I believe the south parts of the country that are different. History as well. Schools for the deaf used to be like most schools in some part of the world, either like boys and girls were taught in different schools, and in the United States, for example, white people and black people were taught in different schools, so that's reflected in some sign languages. Irish Sign Language, I've heard, has a rare form that is very different between men and women, so that's interesting. Like the vocabulary is very different. And education as well, because signs used in schools are usually not the purest form of sign language, but is modified for academic purposes. I believe there was a question there.
So I'm just curious, can you define dialect?
Microphone, sorry.
So is the definition of dialect, I mean, certain percentage non-intercomprehensible, or how do you define dialect as opposed to language?
Yeah, it's basically the same debate as in spoken languages. There's no boundary between what is a language and what is a dialect, and it's the same with sign languages. Another question in front.
Irish heritage, and I'm just wondering, how does an Irish man and an Irish woman communicate if they're speaking sign language, if they have totally different, or maybe not totally, but somewhat different vocabulary or structure?
I've heard it's a rare variant, so most most deaf people in Ireland can understand each other, I believe.
So
There are different languages in Ireland and Northern Ireland, but
So what I'm understanding then is if I'm in a school where the males are learning differently than the females, is this active now or was this in the
No,
day?
it was
Back
more
in the day?
Back then, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Can I move on? There's another question. Yes.
I was wondering if you could just briefly explain like how similar some of these common sign languages are. Like, would an ESL or an ASL and maybe like an FSL be able to kind of understand each other using their sign languages?
So my own experience is that since I use Quebec Sign Language and some American Sign Language, I can understand some French Sign Language. And they're pretty similar in some ways. French Sign Language is a bit more different than the other ones, Quebec Sign Language and American Sign Language, but you can understand quite a bit. Now, if you you watch something in like Japanese Sign Language, it's different. I'm just going to take one last question before I move on because this is the third myth, and there are 10. So yeah. Go ahead. No questions? Okay, perfect. So sign languages are different in all the different parts of language. So in the lexicon and phonology, phonotactics as well. For example, in some sign languages, the spreading of the fingers doesn't make any difference, but in American Sign Language, it's the difference between jail and proof. So that can be important in some languages. Morphology can be quite different. So I mentioned that this is a person in American Sign Language, but in some Asian Sign Languages, this is a man and this is a woman. So they show the difference between men and women. And syntax can also be different. In the Mediterranean area, most hearing speakers, I've been told, can use the backward head tilt to indicate negation, negative meaning to the sentence, to what they're talking about. And it's reflected in some sign languages, like Greek Sign Language and Turkish Sign Language, but surprisingly not in other languages like Italian or Israeli Sign Languages, even though the community uses those gestures. I wanted to mention International Sign, which is not a language, but it's a contact system that is used between signers from different countries who use different sign languages. Sign languages, when you compare them, you find different categories of features. In sign language, there is some pantomime, so acting out something that you're talking about. There are some common grammatical devices that are shared across sign languages, and that helps with understanding another language, but words are usually more distinct between languages. So, moving on to the fourth myth. Sign languages were invented by hearing people. They were not. Sign languages develop naturally. And I'm going to tell you about some interesting cases of language development. So for deaf children who grow up in hearing families with no access to sign language and with very limited access to spoken language, they develop some signs for things, objects, people actions, and they combine them in some ways. So it's not quite a language, but it's the beginning stages of a language. You might have heard of Nicaraguan Sign Language. Who has heard of it? Yeah. So it's a case of a new language being born. So basically the setting was that at Center for the Deaf there was more and more students, and they each came with their own home science system that they used in their community, and it merged, and with each generation it was refined and refined until language was born. And they had no exposure to other sign languages, so that's pretty interesting. Village sign languages, they're also called shared sign languages and rural sign languages. So they're languages used in places where there's a high incidence of deafness, and both deaf and hearing people sign to varying degrees. And these languages usually are missing some grammatical features that are found in other sign languages, like some classifiers, non-manual features, so features that are not on the hands, and syntactic differences. The fourth example is tactile sign languages, which is used by deaf-blind people who, because they are blind or visually impaired enough, cannot access visual cues that are in sign language. So the sign language is perceived through the hands. Someone will put their hand on top of the signer's hand to perceive the movement and the location and the hand shape. Of course, the person cannot access the non-manual features, so features that are not on the hands. So the language is modified to give access to these features with the hands. And in the Seattle area, there's a large deafblind community, and they developed ProTactile, which is a more conventionalized tactile sign language and word view of touch being the primary way to access the world. Okay, so 5. Some people might think, and this can be adjusted to every sign language in the world. So ASL is English on the hands and French, and LSQ is French on the hands, but actually they're independent languages. I'm having trouble with my slides. So there are languages that arose independently. There are different modalities, so they're not the same, but they have a sustained language contact because sign language users, deaf people, are a minority in a larger majority. So the community uses a language like French or English, and the deaf people are kind of part of that community, but in a distinct sub-community. And they're usually schooled with the language of that majority. So there's always some kind of language contact between them. And some signing systems were either spontaneously created or artificially created to kind of merge both sets of languages. But it is possible to borrow from a spoken language into a sign language. The main ways of doing it are mouthing, so doing a sign and moving the lips as if you were speaking. Finger spelling, so sign languages have a way to spell each letter of the spoken language. Even Chinese has an equivalent to pinyin for sign language. Initialization, which is using the first letter of the English word in the sign. So for example, the sign for family starts, the word family starts with an F, so the sign for family has the F hand shape in it. For Chinese characters, it's pretty interesting. So they use, not for all the characters because some of them are really complex and this is not a very efficient solution, but for simple characters like this, this character would be signed like this. So you can see the resemblance between the sign and the character. This one in Chinese Sign Language, Taiwanese Sign Language is signed like this, but in the Japanese Sign Language it's drawn in the air like this. So there are different ways to do it in different languages. So 6. This is interesting. Sign languages cannot be written, so they are not real languages. This is wrong. I bought a book a few days ago on the topic. I found this in a library, like a normal one. I was like so happy about it. You language nerds might understand that. So sign languages can be written, and they are in some ways. So is sign language an unwritten language? It's not unheard of. Some languages in the world, a lot of them, have no written version. Oral cultures, oral traditions are cultures where knowledge is passed orally through speaking or signing in the case of sign languages. So sign languages fall in that category. You might know that a language that is not written is still a language. It's not a requirement for being a language. And notation versus script, I couldn't find exact definitions for them, but from what I understand, a script is a way of writing a language in a general way, but a notation is more specific to some settings. So common ways of writing signs are glosses, which is using a word in the spoken language of the majority to write down the sign. So chair would be written in all caps, chair. And this is interesting. It's done in linguistics, but for a daily use of this writing system, it's not very very doable. Pictures, drawing, and videos are quite common ways of depicting signs, and they work pretty well. This is the drawing for ASL, so ASL. This is just the finger spelling, so you might see shirts or different things with these drawings. In the lounge room, there are some posters in British Sign Language that say, and I don't want to spoil you, but they say keep calm and sign BSL. So if you want to check that out, you can do it later. But this is not writing sign language, it's just taking like English and finger spelling it in sign language. But there are ways to write sign languages. The first person who did this was Auguste Bébian in 1825. He's most widely known for setting up public education in Guadeloupe, but he did work with deaf people and invented a way of writing sign languages, which is in this book. So if you want to look at it later, you could do that. William Stoker, when he investigated American Sign Language, created a notation system to write the signs, and that's how he could show that signs have linguistic principles and minimal pairs and the like. And his writing system is also in that book. Sudden sign writing is the script I like the best. So it's in this book as well. And you might have noticed some weird drawings on my title page for this presentation that was sign writing. Many more exist. There's a lot of them. I can't talk about them all, but it's possible to write sign languages, and people around the world are doing it. So, 7. Sign languages only use your hands. This is wrong, as I mentioned, if you've been listening. Sign languages use your whole body to communicate. So non-manual markers involve the body, the head, facial expressions, different lip movements called mouth morphemes, and the eyes. So looking somewhere can refer to something you've set up in the space before. Like I said, girl and boy. If I look at where I set the sign for boy, it means I refer to boy. So it can be a bit subtle. Sometimes eye blinks can be used to separate clauses as well. So, what are non-manual markers for? They have 2 functions: intonation. Since sign languages do not use sound, you do not have the same kind of prosody where your voice changes in pitch and things like that, but you use your body and your face to reflect what you mean. And it's also used in grammar, for example, with questions, with topicalization. For those who have studied Japanese, you probably know what this is. It's basically putting one part of the sentence and putting emphasis on it and talking about it with the rest of the sentence. Then it's also used for negation and in discourse as well. When you have dialogues, you shift your body to indicate different speakers. If someone is talking to a child, you shift your body and you look down as if the child is in front of you, and if the other person is taller than you, you look up, and you do this with the role shifting. So mother and son pair could be like one looks up and the other looks down, and you do this to show the dialogue. So, are sign languages easy to learn? They're not easy to learn. Of course, the fact that signs look like what they mean a lot of the time can make learning signs easier, but then you forget about the morphology and the syntax, and that's also something you have to consider. Anything can be signed. You can sign university classes. There's in the United States a university that teaches in sign language. It's called Gallaudet, and so classes are given in sign language. You can create poetry. You can make word plays and humor, and basically anything any language can do. And to understand it fully, you have to know the language pretty well. Sign languages are in a different modality than spoken languages are, so you have to learn not only a new language, but a new modality. You have to learn how to use your hands and face and body in a linguistic way. So this is different and needs time to get used to. But gorillas have learned sign language, right? You might have heard of that. Yes. It's not true. Some gorillas have been taught sign language, but the results weren't that great. They could learn some signs. They could use combinations of signs, but they couldn't make their own combinations most of the time, and they only could combine 2 signs. So they didn't learn a sign language. Then sign language prevents a deaf child from learning to speak is a common myth that is heard all over. It's been debunked by a lot of studies, but doctors to this day still advise parents not to use sign language with their children. So if you could spread the word, that would be great. So they're actually learned in similar ways. There have been countless developmental studies that showed that signing babies and hearing and speaking babies have similar timing milestones when acquiring language, from babbling onwards to acquisition of grammar and phonology and everything. They show developmental errors that are like what hearing babies do. And babies can be bilingual and bimodal, and the same principles apply as they do in spoken languages. Okay, the last myth. I know we're running a bit late here, but signs are not processed in the right hemisphere of the brain, like a lot of people think. It's processed in a similar way to spoken languages. So language is processed in the left hemisphere, and visual spatial skills are processed in the right hemisphere. So people thought, since sign language is visual, it must be processed in the right hemisphere, which could make sense, but no, it's really linguistic and processed in the left hemisphere. And people can acquire deficits in sign language just like they do in spoken language. If they have brain injuries, strokes, or different types of disorders, it shows in the signs as it does in spoken languages. So now I'm moving on to 15 reasons to learn a sign language. There are actually 15 on my slides. I realized a few days ago that I forgot one, but now it's complete. So with sign language, you can communicate across a room without shouting. I do not like to shout across rooms, so signing is great for that. You can communicate through windows. That is great, right? You can communicate underwater. You're not limited to fine and up and down. You can talk about the fish you see and everything. Isn't that great? You can communicate when speaking is uncomfortable. When you're sick, your throat hurts, you can sign. If you're in the hospital for whatever reason and you cannot speak, you can sign. You can communicate in noisy environments. I believe a lot of you might have some experience with that. If you're in a bar or a place where people are speaking loud and you cannot understand what the other person is saying, and it's even worse in another language. But you can practice sign languages pretty easily. That's great. You can communicate when you need to be quiet in the library, at the movies, during a presentation or whatever. You can talk with your mouth full. Isn't that great? During this past year, I worked in a school for the deaf, and I got used to signing while eating, and then I started eating with more people who didn't know sign language, and I was like, wait, I need to finish my bite, and then I will talk to you, and it's very inconvenient. You can communicate in secret if other people don't know sign language. You cannot be sure. But I hope this reason disappears with time, because I would like sign languages to be more widely known. But for now, it's a good reason to learn it. You can practice your new language where you live, because since deaf people are a minority in every place in the world, you might find someone who uses a sign language where you live. So you don't have to go to another country to learn it. In case you lose your hearing or have a deaf child in your family in the future, learning how to sign is great. You have this preparation that is already done. You can describe scenes in detail. I'm not at that level yet, but there are videos on YouTube of people reenacting movie scenes in sign language, so you can do the zooming in and all the action in sign language is pretty cool. You can follow what interpreters are saying. You might have heard of the disaster that happened in South Africa a few years ago, where the interpreter was not signing anything that made sense. So you could follow what interpreters are signing, and if you are if you're a bit distracted and you miss what the person is saying, you look at the interpreter, since there is usually a delay, and you can catch that information. You can improve your storytelling skills because you add a lot of visual cues to your storytelling. And this is my favorite reason of all. You discover an entirely new language, an entirely new culture that if you've only learned spoken languages before, this is a very good reason to discover a sign language. So my presentation is over, and now it's time for questions. Yeah. Yes, that is true. You can always ask me questions during the break or during the day.
So I've heard that you can make plays on words and puns in sign language, and I wanted to know if you know of any and can show us one.
Not on the top of my head, no. Oh.
Okay, so I have one. Sometimes sperm is ejaculation is like male. You can do like this too.
Yeah.
It's like one of like among so many, but that's the first one that pops into my head.
Yes.
Thank you for that.
A lot of people use. A lot of people use the sign for yellow instead. Another question?
Hi there. Thanks for the talk. So I've got quite a few friends who listen to a lot of loud music, and they work at meat factories, so I'm worried if they blow out their ears and then lose a hand, will they be able to still communicate?
Well, if you lose a hand, they have the other hand.
And how many gestures would you say are like using two hands compared to one hand?
I don't know the exact percentage, but people sign with one hand a lot of the time. If you're holding something or busy doing something, it's done a lot of the time. If you break an arm, it's been done before.
Cool.
It's a bit harder to understand if you're not used to it, but it's quite okay.
Thank you.
One more question?
I just want to say I went to university for American Sign Language and I signed multiple sign languages. So if anyone's really curious later and you see me around, feel free to ask me anything.
Cool.
Yeah.
So, before my presentation truly ends, I'm just going to teach you how to clap in sign language. You probably know it, right? A lot of people do at the back. So for the people in front who can't see it, it's like this. You just shake your hands. Thank you.